Hello, this is Dr. Prashanth and welcome back to Epidemiology lecture series. In this lecture, we will discuss on the topic infectious diseases. So there are three important terms to know. One is CFR, that is case fatality rate. Number of deaths from a disease divided by number of clinical cases of that disease, that particular disease. So whereas in inapparent infection, the infection is present in a host without occurrence of recognizable clinical signs or symptoms. Whereas in clinical disease, we see the signs and symptoms that are more easily recognized. So basically, infectious diseases can result in a wide variety of clinical effects ranging from inapparent infection to severe clinical illness or death. So these are the three outcomes of any disease, right? The disease can remain inapparent, that means it do not manifest disease, or the disease can lead to clinical illness and finally death. Some infections that are usually inapparent, that is, they do not manifest disease, may nonetheless be considered severe because they have high case fatality rate or a high rate of clinical manifestations in those who are clinically ill. Let's see this with an example. For example, St. Louis encephalitis has a ratio of clinical to inapparent infections is approximately 1 to 200. That means one clinical case for 200 inapparent infections. So based on the above data, what we can say that it's not severe, right? Because as most of the infections are inapparent that do not manifest disease, we might consider them as severe, not severe. But in reality, the CFR among the clinically ill may be as high as 15 to 20%. So this is the best example for the above statement. Disease severity from the point of view of public health impact. So basically, when you see from the individual point of view, for example, a disease of low incidence and high CFR, example rabies, may be severe for individuals, but a disease with high incidence and lesser severity, example influenza, may be a much more serious problem from a public health standpoint. Why? Because it causes excess mortality in a population as a whole. Even the disease is less severe, but due to high incidence in a population, it might lead to excess mortality. So basically, there are three classes of infections based on the previous concept. One is class A, inapparent infection frequent. So when you use the word inapparent, that the infection do not manifest disease, right? Example is tubercle bacillus. So if you can see the diagram, majority of the portion or majority of the proportion of the cases are inapparent, the green color. And if you can see, very few cases are fatal and most of the cases are clinically ill. Coming to the second class of infection, class B, clinical disease frequent. So the best example is measles virus. So if you can see the diagram, the green part, that is the proportion of inapparent infection, is very small compared to the clinical part, that is the C. So basically in the class B, there are also very few fatal deaths, if you can see the red part. And coming to the last class of infection, that is class C or infectious, which is usually fatal. So the best example is rabies virus, and if you can see the diagram, the majority or the major portion of the cases are fatal, the red part. So let's look into the components of infectious disease process. Broadly, there are two types. One is the agent itself, and the second part is the host parasite interactions or the host agent interactions. So in the first case, that is the agent itself, the intrinsic properties of infectious agents. Many characteristics of infectious agents are agent determined or intrinsic to that agent itself, and they do not depend on any interaction with a host. Examples: the morphology of the agent, size, chemical character, antigenic makeup, ability to survive outside a host, ability to produce toxins, etc. And now coming to the host parasite interactions, basically these are the interactions between the host and the agent. So there are four important terms. One is infectivity, pathogenicity, virulence, and immunogenicity. These four come under the category of host-agent interactions. Let's look into each of these briefly. Infectivity. Infectivity is defined as the ability of an agent to invade and multiply in a host. Example: high infectivity in case of measles and for low infectivity, leprosy. What is pathogenicity? Pathogenicity is defined as the ability to produce clinical apparent illness. And coming to the virulence, it can be defined as the proportion of clinical cases resulting in severe clinical manifestations. So one way of measuring virulence can be the case fatality rate. Based on that, we can say whether there is high virulence or not. And coming to the immunogenicity, it can be defined as the infection's ability to produce specific immunity. For example, agent of measles produce lifelong immunity in a person or an individual. Pathogenic mechanism. There are several mechanisms for infectious process. Let's look into some of them. 1. Direct tissue invasion, production of a toxin, immunologic enhancement or allergic reaction leading to damage to the host, persistent or latent infection, enhancement of host susceptibility to drugs of otherwise minimal toxicity. And the last one is the immune suppression. So, more than one mechanism may be involved simultaneously, or different mechanisms may lead to illness with clinically different characteristics as a result of infection by the same pathogen. If the same pathogen choose the mechanism of direct tissue invasion and also through immune suppression, there might be different clinical symptoms and both might lead to different kind of illness. Human as reservoir. So what is a reservoir? Reservoirs may be defined as the living organisms or inanimate matter in which an infectious agent normally lives and multiplies. So examples can be human being, animals and environmental sources. And basically an infectious process happen in stages. So there are 3 stages. Starting with the first stage, that is colonization. The agent is present on the surface of the body and propagate at a rate sufficient to maintain its number without producing identifiable evidence of any reaction in the host. In the second stage, covert or subclinical or inapparent infections, which we have already discussed. In this type of reaction, the organism not only multiply in number but also cause a measurable reaction that, however, is not clinically detectable. So in this stage, we cannot see clinical signs or symptoms. Okay. And coming to the last stage, overt or infectious disease. In this stage, clinical signs and symptoms are seen along with physical findings, or both are present. We can see clinical signs and symptoms or physical findings or both together. Carrier. Carrier is an infected person who does not have apparent clinical illness or clinical disease but is nevertheless a potential source of infection to others. So there are basically 4 types of carriers. One is inapparent throughout. That means the term itself, inapparent. The infection do not manifest disease, right? So it's asymptomatic throughout. And coming to the second type, incubatory carrier. Carrier stage precedes manifest disease. Before the disease manifests, we can say this stage. So we call it as an incubatory carrier. And opposite to this, convalescent carrier. Carrier stage follows manifest disease. After manifest disease, we see this stage. And the last one is the chronic carrier. Carrier stage persists for a long period of time in chronic carrier type. And now coming to the mechanism of transmission of infection, there are 2 types of transmission. One is direct and indirect. In direct transmission, immediate transfer of an infectious agent from an infected host or reservoir to an appropriate portal or entry, for example, droplets, kissing, etc. Indirect transmission. So there are 3 types of indirect transmission. One is vehicle-borne, vector-borne and airborne transmission. In vehicle-borne, it happens through inanimate objects like bedding, toys, food, water, etc. In vector-borne, through arthropod. For example, malaria is transmitted by Anopheles mosquitoes. And in airborne transmission, the transmission is through dusts and droplet nuclei. Person to person spread of disease. So basically there are 3 important concepts in person to person spread of disease. One is generation time. It is nothing but the period between the receipt of infection by a host and maximal communicability of that host. And coming to the herd immunity, the second important concept, resistance of a group to invasion and spread of an infectious agent based on the immunity of a high proportion of individual members of the group. And the last one is the secondary attack rates. It is defined as the number of cases of a disease developing during a stated time period among those members of a closed group who are at risk. So if you can see, a secondary rate is nothing but number of new cases in group minus initial case or cases divided by number of susceptible persons in group minus initial cases during specified time period. So basically in this formula, we subtract the initial case or cases from both numerator and denominator. Thank you.